in preparation for this talk, I went back and reread Marv's famous Fads, Fashions, and Folderol, and I was just stunned again at how good that article is. If you've not read that article, you have to read it. I mean, it's phenomenal. Marv argued that we should pit theories against each other using the method of strong inference. John Platt had just published a paper in Science the year before with strong inference as title, and Marv expanded on that and showed how it could affect psychology. He called the method finding out, thus the title of my talk. I took it right out of Marv. It also occurred to me that Marv's article was dramatically similar to a very famous article by a very famous physicist, Feynman. He wrote a very interesting article titled Cargo Cult Science, and I won't tell you what he means by that. You'll have to go read it. But this is a brilliant article. And the overlap and the complementarity with Marv's article is stunning. Marv called this behavior that he didn't like Folderol, methodological ceremonies conducted in the name of rigorous research. And you all know tons of articles like that. Feynman called it cargo cult science, following all the apparent percepts and forms of scientific investigation, but going nowhere, literally going nowhere. So let me again urge you, if you have some spare time, these are great articles. Now, the Folderol and cargo cult science discussed by Dunnette and Feynman are now called questionable research practices. Well, Marv listed 5 of them. Actually, he listed more of them, but these, I think, are the most important ones. And to just give you a sense of how up-to-date Marv was 50 years ago, I'm going to give you 5 articles published in the last couple of years that deal with each one of these. Literally. Nobody listened to Marv. If we'd have listened to Marv 50 years ago, we'd be way ahead. Now, the first one is from one of our own, Frank Schmidt. You'll see, Frank, I'm a fan of Frank Schmidt, known him a long time. This is a wonderful paper, and he does make a very important point. One of the omitted relevant research issues that you should deal with is behavior genetics, and I agree with Frank on that, and I'll show you that he's right. The American Statistical Association in 2016 had to come out with a paper on the abuse of null hypothesis testing. And he was telling us about it 50 years ago. Failure to specify boundary conditions. Last year, Perspectives in Psychological Science published a paper with the title Constraints on Generality. If you read it, it says you should specify the boundary conditions regarding what you can generalize about from your findings. Marv has a nice 3 paragraphs on exactly that issue. Bias. The problem of bias, of course, there must be 100 papers out within the last couple of years on exactly that topic. But I thought this one was especially nice because it deals with a sister discipline, economics, and I was stunned by the results. Ioannidis has published a lot of papers on research methodologies and is now very famous for this work. But he told our sister colleagues in economics that they were falsely reporting effects and sometimes exaggerating them by a factor of 4. A lot of us think economics are pretty sophisticated statisticians, but I guess we're probably wrong about that. Finally, failure to estimate effect size. As you can see, I am a fan of Frank. I'm citing him again, 2016. Frank has outlined a sizable part of the solution to the whole problem of replication and the replication crisis. It's measuring effect sizes and reporting effect sizes properly. Marv, again, has a whole little section on that. that reads very, very nicely. He was, if you think about it, he was incredibly prescient, but nobody listened. Again, if we'd have listened to Marv, we'd be much further ahead today. Well, I've given you all these flaws, so I've sort of set myself up. The question is, did Bouchard do any better? And I think you have to ask that as we move along. Before discussing my own work, let me provide some context. My frame of reference is Darwinian and evolutionary. I've always been interested in evolution and biological matters. I read Darwin long ago and reread him. And in one of his most famous books, he made it clear that psychological traits, mental qualities, were inherited, were transmitted in some manner. Darwin knew nothing about genes, although an interesting historical note, the famous Mendelian paper was in his library, and at that time, you had to cut open the pages of books. And that paper had never been cut open. So Darwin never read Mendel and had no idea about Mendelian genetics. And he argued both from animals and experimental work, because Darwin contacted breeders all over the world about how they improve their herds in animals. But he also talked about humans and said these things are inherited. So the question really is, was Darwin correct about the inheritance of human mental qualities? Now you may think that's a silly question, tilting at windmills. So I'm going to address two major critics of work in behavior genetics and try to show you that they're completely wrong. At the time I joined the faculty at Minnesota in 1969, Arthur Jensen had just published a highly controversial Harvard Educational Review article. Shortly thereafter, Richard Herrnstein published a famous book on IQ and the meritocracy. So we have two arguments here. IQ is heritable. IQ influences the IQ differences in social classes. I defended these scholars' right to publish. I disagreed with a few things, but not everything. Now, the argument was later updated by Herrnstein, by the way, and I wrote a very positive review of that book for APA. But the defense of these scholars was at a cost. Here's an example of a flyer that was spread all over the campus at the time. Just one of many. I have, I think, 15 pages of stuff in my history of this sort. And of course, they wanted the unconditional firing of Bouchard. The University of Minnesota supported everything I did, all my research, and my right to study anything I wanted from day one. And I want to say thank you, University of Minnesota. There's no question about it. Okay, I want to also take a slight historical detour and make the point that Marv wasn't the only person that was ever ignored. I want to mention one of psychology's most brilliant and unappreciated psychologists, Barbara Stoddard Burks, a student of Lewis Terman. This paper, Hazards, written in 1928, mentions many of the same issues that Marv brought up, plus additional ones. She also studied 4 sets of monozygotic twins reared apart. Barbara Burks was a brilliant psychologist, and I'm going to go a little bit further. Let me point out, this is an absolute classic paper in causation in psychology. Barbara Burks was the first psychologist to implement Sewell Wright's method of path analysis. And then it lay dormant for 50 years. Brilliant people sometimes get completely ignored. In a 1970 paper, my colleague Paul Meehl cited this paper and wrote, "I have sometimes wondered whether it's only in the inexact sciences that rather simple methodological truths have to be noticed afresh after the passage of an academic generation. Do we actually get told how to do things properly and then just forget them? It's absolutely amazing, because we do. Barbara Burks wrote a classic paper, very well-controlled study in 1928, demonstrating that IQ was a largely heritable trait. A number of years later, she did another study and demonstrated quite conclusively that IQ varied by social class for genetic reasons. That study was beautifully replicated by Sandra Scar, 50 years later. Here's replicable results, no question about it. Okay, so I'm about to launch a study of twins reared apart. 1979. What's the intellectual context? Well, there's a book published by Leon Kamen, a very famous and distinguished animal learning theorist, and a very smart guy, no question about it. But he introduced politics into the realm. It's in the title of his book. And he made 3 arguments. One, there exists no data which should lead a prudent man to accept the hypothesis that IQ scores are in any degree heritable, and that the MZA data, the twins reared apart data, simply could not stand up to analysis. The question is, how did he do this? Well, he did this using what I called pseudo-analysis. He partitioned groups into very small n's, some as small as 4 cases, and said, well, when you group them this way, they become very, very similar. In fact, he had some groups where the twins had IQ correlations well above what we were able to show in our studies. The data was absolutely absurd, and I called the procedure pseudo-analysis after meta-analysis. Unfortunately, the term never took. Nobody uses it. In fact, I Googled it, and I got 0 hits. I Googled meta-analysis, and I got 11 million hits. He finally made another claim, which I want to put up here for IO psychologists. He claimed that IQ tests didn't measure cognitive ability. He provided no evidence whatsoever, none. This was a fatuous claim in 1974. Nevertheless, Kamen became famous for writing this book. It tells you something about the capacity of psychology to properly evaluate data. It's kind of embarrassing. Now, the second person I want to address who disagrees with Darwin is even more famous. His name is Stephen Jay Gould. We launched our study of twins reared apart between the publication of Kamen's book and Gould's book. And they were both very, very popular. Notice, Richard Atkinson, president of the University of California, faculty member from Stanford University, thought this book was a remarkable piece of scholarship and recommended it to people to learn about IQ. Now, let me just claim right now, Gould is wrong on almost everything. Almost everything, okay? He argued that everything having to do with IQ tests was biased. Interestingly enough, almost everything he said was biased. It's a patent demonstration of his own thesis. The book is. Let me give you some examples. I'm only going to give you 2, but there are many. And if you doubt me, go to Google and Google the mismeasure of man, because there's a huge section devoted to it. They miss a lot of stuff, but they make the point pretty clearly. He missed the boat. Notice, this is a paper published in Science. Morton's ranking of races by cranial capacity, unconscious manipulation of data may be a scientific norm. He calls Samuel Morton a self-styled objective empiricist. The sanctimoniousness of Gould's books is just stunning. I could give you example after example. It's just awful. Notice in the title, he generalizes to all science from one case. I'm not sure that's allowed. What do you think? In the title of a science article. Okay, that particular material was completely reanalyzed by a group of experts. And they went back over it and they said, overall, we find that Morton's initial reputation as the objectivist of his era was well described. And they talk about Gould's claim as being a mismeasure of science. That's having the whole thing turned on you pretty rigorously. We all are biased. And that's what Marv was talking about, using multiple methods. He actually talks about cross replications with different measures so that you avoid these kinds of problems. It's a methodological issue, and Gould just didn't apply the right methodology. Okay, let me point out, Kamen and Gould were not the only people who were against IQ testing. Here's a publication that appeared in the year we started our study on testing, teaching, and learning, okay? Ralph Taylor was the key author. Ralph Taylor was the first director of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, a position he held for 14 years. That center is one of the intellectual centers of the universe, literally. And here we have the director telling us absolute nonsense. Now, I don't know why Tyler said this, but it's absolutely wrong. Most of us have spent our entire professions measuring these things, and making such a claim is absolutely absurd. So, would you go launch a study of twins when people are saying all that kinds of stuff about you? I don't know. I did. For completeness, I have to discuss Cyril Burt. A lot of you may know Cyril Burt carried out a study of monozygotic twins ripped apart in England back in the 50s and gathered data, published as late as the 60s, and gathered data going back probably as early as 1920. He came and argued his data was a fraud. And he had a pretty good argument. I cannot argue with that. Because the consistency in his data was quite stunning. Unfortunately, I got exactly the same consistency in my data. So that made me question Kamen. A lot was made of this. Kamen discovered it, so to speak. Gould spent a whole chapter on it. And a statistician by the name of Donald Dorfman, he's a psychologist actually, wrote a major article in Science about it. Now, the last book, and there were at least 4 books published on this topic. The last book was published by Nick McIntosh, a distinguished psychologist, thoroughly familiar with the IQ literature, and like Kamen, originally an animal psychologist, and Nick Massey Taylor, a distinguished anthropologist, also quite familiar with the IQ literature. I'm a friend of Nick Massey Taylor. I've known him for many years. They concluded that Burt's social mobility data, a totally different data set, was fraudulent and provided the critical evidence that Burt was a fraud. And that's the argument, Burt's a fraud. Well, interestingly enough, 20 years later, Gavin Trudeau, a fellow of the Royal Anthropological Society and a mathematician and statistician by training, went through Dorfman's science paper, practically sentence by sentence, and showed that he was completely wrong. That what Burt did was used methods that were readily available to any person of statistical background and would generate exactly the data he did. That Dorfman's claims were completely wrong. Burt was actually the editor of one of the major statistical journals in England, so he was not a dummy about statistics. He knew about all the methods. This was a devastating paper, and Trudeau points out, once his procedures are properly understood, the balance of the evidence lies heavily in Burt's favor. Now, I'm not arguing that Burt couldn't have been fraudulent. It's possible, but I've read all the literature, and I think it's clearly still an open question. All right, moving on to my own work. In 1981, my graduate student, Matt McGew, and I updated a very famous summary of the literature. This is the summary of the literature. It's actually a rough and ready meta-analysis. All the data points are there. They're clustered by group, and you can see the spread, and you can see the mean. But all the tricks of the trade that Frank has brought to bear weren't available. None of us actually thought about it. In some ways, it's a very simple issue, but a lot of brilliant people didn't see it until Frank brought sample size to our attention. Most of the variation in there, not all of it, is sample size. We updated that data in a science paper in 1981. We doubled the number of studies, but there still was a lot of spread. But the feature of both of these studies is that they followed all the admonitions that Marv had told us. It used strong inference. Monozygotic twins read apart could be compared with unrelated individuals read together. One looks at heredity, one looks at environment. Various combinations in between can be used to cross-check those particular findings. It's called model fitting in behavior genetics. It avoided the null hypothesis testing because it was absolutely unnecessary. You just look at all the data. Who cares whether it's different from the null hypothesis? It's a stupid hypothesis anyways. It specified boundary conditions. They said we found some genetic influence, we found some environmental influence, but the data is not precise enough to actually lock all of this down. Okay? It avoided bias by presenting all of the data. Here's everything. If we don't have it all here, look it up and tell us. And it estimated effect sizes. And it compared those effect sizes with that postulated by a particular theory, the theory of genetic influence. It's as neat a way to do it as you can do. Okay. Now I want to turn to our research, and I do want to step back a moment, and because a lot of people are not entirely familiar with this. What does the MZA correlation tell us? The correlation for any trait between a pair of monozygotic twins reared apart. Well, it's analogous to the Hoyt reliability. And actually, the Hoyt reliability is basically the predecessor for Cronbach's alpha, except it was discovered by a University of Minnesota educational psychologist in Burton Hall 50 years earlier and published in Psychometric. But nobody remembered. But what it does is it tells us the amount of variance due to a true score. If you've taken your psychometric scores, you know that. So you just calculate the correlation between monozygotic twins reared apart, and you're told if the sample is proper and the study's been done right, the amount of variance due to genes. I've turned Hoyt's little model into the standard behavior genetic model. The T and the H are path coefficients. Barbara Burke told us about path coefficients in 1928. Sewell Wright had written about it in agriculture even before that. But nobody in psychology paid any attention. You wonder if there's some things around, in fact there are, that ought to be implemented and haven't been. And I'll show you one right here. First, the reason we can draw causal conclusions is because the monozygotic twins are an experiment of nature. Two genotypes basically identical. The twins are adopted. It's an experiment of society. You've disentangled heredity and environment. Julia Rohr has called this control of confounding by design. What you do is get rid of the confounding. Genetic and environmental influences are unconfounded. Now, this is a beautiful little article, and it just came out in January by a young woman. I don't think she has her PhD yet. So who are you going to listen to? The old fogies or the young people? This is the first, actually the second, James Lee, who's at Minnesota, did the first one in the European Journal of Personality, attempt to bring an enormous body of thinking about causality by Judea Pearl to the attention of psychologists. And this article does it beautifully. If you're interested in this topic, I strongly recommend this article. In an understatement, she says, quotes, one source of potentially spurious association that has perhaps been underappreciated in psychology is genetic confounding between parents and their offspring. Of course, this is precisely the argument Barbara Burke's made and Paul Meehl made. Simple methodological procedures are staring us in the face and not being implemented. It's almost scary, or maybe it is scary. Okay. Give you one other model. I don't want to bore you with this, but the correlation between unrelated individuals reared together, no genes, they just hopefully you randomly sample, tells you the effect of being reared in the same family, what we call common environmental influence. People who've been arguing that social class or the family you grow up in, et cetera, are the major cause of similarity between siblings or parents and offspring, et cetera, all they had to do was go off and collect this data to prove their case. The number of such studies is almost negligible. We have the methods staring us in the face, which tells me a lot of psychologists don't want to put their theories to test in the way that Marv outlined very, very clearly 50 years ago. It turns out, interestingly, this correlation was critical to understanding the variance in our own 1981 data. Part of the variance is because heritability varies with age. And had we looked at it properly, we would have discovered it. We completely missed it. If you look at the heritabilities based on twin samples, once they become adults, it just jumps up. And shared environment jumps down. But the unrelated reared together clinches the case. Two totally different methods. Again, Marv said use multiple methods. Shows exactly the same thing. If you measure unrelated together as children, you get enormous variability, and a good part of that is sample size. But if you measure them as adults, it drops to near zero. And there's been replication since. That explains much of the variance. But now you can understand why there was so much argument. Some people were looking at heritabilities based on very young people, children, and others were looking at adults. And they were really different. You just had to know age was the major moderator. Well, I've summarized that data. Some colleagues of mine in the Netherlands, Dorette Bloemsma is a friend of mine, had collected data over the years, and I plotted it and fit a nice curve to it. It's a little misleading because the age scale is not really linear. So, you know, but I specify that in the table, so you know it's there ahead of time. If you actually put all the data in the world together, it just fits beautifully. It just fits beautifully. There's no question that there's an age effect. A lot of this is also confounded by tests with different reliability, and there's less reliability in the children than there is in the adults, but it really fits together quite beautifully. And so this data would tell you that IQ has a heritability, yeah, at least in the 50s, and in the 60s and 70s. You can see the variation. The quality of the tests was dramatically different as well. But I don't think there's any need to actually nail down a specific figure. It's there, it's sizable, and it should be dealt with whenever you do a correlation between biological relatives. And the literature is rampant with such correlations. Now, there is a possible real problem here. There's a phenomena known as the scar-row interaction. The argument that in lower socioeconomic classes, heritability is lower, and it's higher in high social classes. And so it's an argument about an environmental interaction with the genotype. And it's a very plausible hypothesis. I talked with Sandra, was a colleague of mine for a number of years at the Institute of Human Development, and I talked to her about it. David Rowe was a friend of mine, so I talked about it. And my colleague and mentor, Herb Gottesman and Eric Turkheimer, are big proponents of this. But I didn't believe it. Just in December, a major study was published on this topic. It's well worth reading. It turns out this is a very, very difficult topic to explore with any precision, because there are a variety of different kinds of confounds no matter what you do. So I want to make that very clear. But they carried out a huge study with the most diverse population to study this hypothesis, and they found zero. Not only that, sometimes it went in the other direction, which really is very interesting. And they were able to compute heritabilities for different age groups, and they fit the age curve I showed you a minute ago. So I would argue this issue is still open until we really solve it. But it's not slam dunk that it's true by any stretch. Age curves occur for a wide variety of traits, both psychological and physical. And so I want to just alert you to that. This is data from conservatism, a construct I'll talk about a bit later. What you can see is identical twins and fraternal twins simply don't differ until you get to early 20s. And then genetic effects manifest themselves. The idea that genes have their effect very, very early in life and then it's permanent is just flat wrong. It's something I was taught in introductory psychology courses. You see genetic effects early, and then environment shapes the trait, and so later in life, everything is environmental. It's absolutely wrong, but it's interesting. We were all taught that, and even some famous geneticists were taught that. John Paul Scott studied various breeds of dogs from birth until adulthood. And they said in their monograph, this is one of the most famous monographs in behavior genetics, we thought we'd see the effects of genetics early in life, and then as the animals grew up, be less and less more environmental. And he said, we found the opposite. The various breeds of dogs are much more alike as youngsters, and as they got older and older, but raised in exactly the same conditions, their genetic characteristics come to manifest themselves. So if you think genes are important early and not later, you're wrong. It's just not the case. Okay, let's turn to MISTRA, the Minnesota Study of Twins Read Apart. Actually, if you want to know anything about it, it's all in Nancy Siegel's book. This study began as a clinical case study of a single pair of monozygotic twins read apart. You can ask the question, why do such a study? My motivation for the study was sheer curiosity. I wanted to see such a pair of twins for myself. I'd read this controversial literature and I said, Bouchard, when I heard about these twins, I said, Bouchard, you have to see these twins, okay? I went around the department seeing my colleagues, Irv Gottesman, David Licken, Alka Tellegen, Len Heston over in psychiatry. And I said, you know, can I use your lab? I'm going to bring these twins in. And David had a psychophysiology lab. Len was over in psychiatry. Alka had the multidimensional personality questionnaire. And Irv Gottesman was the world's twin researcher. Everybody said to me, you're crazy. What do you want? What are you going to get studying a single pair of twins? Who do you think you are, Skinner? You know? It's a waste of time and money. I literally begged them. I said, humor me. Just, you know, let them spend a couple hours in your lab. And they're all friends. And they said, okay, we'll do it. So we studied a single pair of twins. The University of Minnesota funded the first pair of twins. They were willing to put up, I think, about $8,000, pay for airfare, pay for hotels, etc. A little crazy, but I was the chair of the committee with the money. So when I asked the committee for money, they gave it to me. It was kind of interesting. Fortunately, publicity about the first pair of twins quickly revealed there were additional twin pairs available and numerous adoptees looking for their co-twins. There were a whole variety of organizations all over the United States and England, Australia, New Zealand that engaged in bringing adoptees together with their biological families, and they did this for twins. And of course, they heard about, I got a lot of publicity, and they heard about it and contacted me. Within literally a couple of weeks, I went to Jack Darley, chairman of my department. I said, Jack, I got all these possible twins for a study. And Jack said, great, you'll need a grant, and I know where you can get it. And he made a phone call to here in Chicago, to the Hancock Tower, and said, I know people at the Spencer Foundation. I'm going to call them. And they said, you got 4 days to submit a grant because the deadline is next week. So I wrote a grant, submitted it, and the Spencer Foundation funded all of our initial studies. I think the first 4 or 5 pairs after the pair funded by the University of Minnesota. So Jack Darley is an example of a superb department chairman. That's the kind of way you should act. And I can tell you, I learned when I was the department chairman, which I was for 6 years during the course of this study, I tried to help my colleagues as much as possible. That's your job. And he certainly did his job. We then submitted to federal agencies, mostly NSF. We did get a small NSF grant, one. The study was largely funded by private foundations until we were well established, and then we got money for dental research and for medical research, but not for psychological research. There are biases in psychology, not just about how you do studies, but about what you study and what kind of questions you can ask. The funding is entirely described in the appendix of Nancy Siegel's book, so you can certainly find it there. Okay, we launched our studies. My graduate students were all happy to participate, and here are 2 of them. There's Jeff, learning his trade. But Bouchard was learning his trade at the same time. This is my first assessment. So we learned together, actually, and that's what we did. We sat down and hashed out things, etc., and I got to tell you, it was rough and ready, no question. But it was unbelievably fun. We met people from all over the world, from every status in life, and because they had a twin, they knew why we were interested in what we were doing. And they asked us questions about it, and they were happy to participate. You didn't have to convince these people. Almost all of them just jumped right in. Sometimes we had two sets of twins at the same time. The two twins in the background, the Shan twins, were actually brought to my attention by Ruth Canfer, IO psychologist many of you may know. The other pair of twins were brought to my attention by John Stroud, and I'll talk about him in a minute. The Shan twins were from Scotland, the other twins were from England. We actually had a large sample of twins from England. And this is Mary Moster, one of my graduate students, and there's Bouchard hiding in the background over there. Here's a couple of monozygotic twins reared apart, just to give you a representative sample of what's going on. These twins over on the left with the beards, they had those beards when they met, and this photograph was taken something like 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later. Once we heard about them, we got them in from England. The twins up in the right-hand corner look like they're discordant for eyeglasses, but the other twin is wearing contacts, so they're concordant for eye problems. But I have a small world problem here, or issue. We've all read about the small world problem. Stanley Milgram's really famous work, best social psychology work ever done, is my opinion, was done by Stanley Milgram. No question about it. I used to be a small group social psychologist, so I know a little bit about that. The twins, the triplets in the middle met, I think they were in their 50s, middle 50s. Turns out the twin on your far right was a police officer on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. So I said, oh, it's going to be a cinch to recruit these guys. I'll just tell them the professors I know in the psychology department, and they'll say, well, I tried to get him to come. He wouldn't come. Just wouldn't come. So I said, well, I'm going to be at a conference in Berkeley in a couple of months. Can I stop and have lunch with you? And he said, sure. So a couple of months later, I get to the campus and go to the police department, and I meet him. And we walk over to the Dunnette Hotel, and we have lunch. And we no more than sit down. He said, I got the goods on you. He said, we arrested you and put you in prison. And I said, you're right, you did. I'd been arrested. He did his due diligence. He looked me up in the police records. So pretty good cop. In any event, he would not participate. So I told him, I said, look, if you ever change your mind, let us know. 2 years later, I get a letter. By the way, this was all done before email. Everything was done by mail correspondence and phone. He said he'll participate. So we brought him to Minnesota. Here are a couple of twins, fraternal twins. The twins in the lower left-hand corner, by the way, are from Minneapolis. They lived right in town, which was kind of interesting. This pair of twins up here, the one on the right, is an educational psychologist from Scotland. So she got into David Licken's lab, and I'll point out the Raven is administered by computer. So she sits down, and David says, well, I'm going to have you do this task, and he's got an example item. She says, oh, that's the Raven. I've given that 100 times. I know all the answers. So that's missing data. The twins over on the other side, I won't mention which one, but one of them was raised as a young girl for, I think, 6 or 7 years in a brothel. To give you an idea of the range of circumstances, some of these twins. The range of circumstances is enormous. And the idea that these twins were somehow placed in upper class, middle class homes, and therefore that's why they're similar, is completely wrong. In fact, one of our pairs of twins were the 12th and 13th children in a family, and they were both put up for adoption because the family just couldn't afford to deal with them anymore. So the range turned out to be quite enormous. The middle twins, I won't say which one, but when I found them, I called his wife, and she was in tears. She said, the police have just taken him away because he violated his parole and he's going back to prison. We had to wait, I think, 2 or 3 years before we could get him into the assessment. Again, give you some idea of the range of circumstances. Here's a photograph of a 1987 reunion of our twins in England. It's in Derby, East Midlands. You can see this is an adult sample. Actually, I don't have a, way over on the right are the Shan twins, who I pointed out to you earlier. This is an adult sample, and it's very, very representative in our opinion, and the data show that. Now, a lot of those twins were recruited or reunited, both recruited and reunited, by John Stroud, who was sitting in the middle. He was a social worker in a county just north of London, and he had helped adoptees find biological relatives for many years. And when he heard about our study, he contacted me. Turns out we ended up becoming real friends. And he recruited a number of the twins in that reunion. So we had people like John, actually in Australia. Nick Martin, actually in Australia, helped me recruit a number of twins. We had twins from New Zealand, and we had a few twins from Europe, Sweden in particular. So John represents one of, this is a list of 100 people who were involved in the study over 20 years. This was a highly collaborative adventure. I was involved in the assessment of every single pair of twins, but I didn't do it all by myself by any stretch of the imagination. Enormous number of people, and another 60 or 70 people could be mentioned in terms of twin finders or people who've done work for us, and administrative people throughout the University of Minnesota. The people over in the grants department and in accounting, I actually sometimes fell way behind in my ability to cover costs. Everybody at the University of Minnesota went enormously out of their way to facilitate my research. Minnesota was the absolutely ideal place to do this work. I had full support from the department, from my colleagues, and from staff in the medical school and in the grants administration, et cetera. I was as lucky as you could possibly get. There's just no doubt about it. Okay, I do want to mention one other thing. I have a wife back there who had to put up with an incredibly busy husband all during this time. As I pointed out, for 6 years I was actually the department chairman as well as running these studies. And I conducted a number of assessments off-site in England, in New York City. And she was my partner. She administered tests, did interviews, etc. So not only did I have help from the university and from colleagues, but I had help from the family. My daughter actually helped do a number of things. I was so hard up, so to speak, that when I had a pair of older twins in England that I couldn't persuade to come, and I was in England, my mother was in France. And I said, Mom, fly over here and talk to these people. Maybe we can convince them to be in the study. And she did, and they came to Minnesota. So I was ruthless about what it took to recruit twins. What's that? Oh, yeah, well, there she is. Stand up. I tell you, she's put up with unbelievable difficulties. Okay, here's a sample of an assessment. You can imagine putting now, we brought in spouses whenever, and that helped us recruit with a vengeance. There's no question about it. But the spouses didn't go through everything, but you can see there are all kinds of medical and dental and other things involved here, which I'm not even going to talk about at all. This makes it look neat, but I can tell you nothing ever works like you plan. Never does. Well, I do want to mention that we covered the expenses for the twins, but we did not pay them to participate, except we gave them a $75 honorarium for coming to Minnesota for a week. Okay, the most famous article we published was in Science in 1990, and we summarized virtually all of our psychological studies. This article was published as a lead article of Science in their first genome issue. I think they've had 5 or 6 genome issues since, but so we got front page display. It's really very, very nice. In the same year, we published the first article about the Minnesota Twin Family Registry. We actually, once we got our study going, we realized, as Marv suggested, that we needed comparison groups. Ordinary twins, non-adoptees. And so we built a huge twin registry. This was the beginning of a huge body of behavior genetic research that continues on in the psychology department today. So we immediately built a control comparison group to see if we could replicate our findings. This is the IQ data from about 1992, and the reason for 92 will become clear in a minute. You can see the enormous consistency of the studies. The results of all the tests are at the far end. And the last study, 1992, by Pettersson et al., was done in Sweden. Nancy Pettersson was an honors undergraduate of mine in individual differences. She went on to get a degree in behavior genetics at Colorado and became the head twin researcher at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. So I'm very proud of that. I had a real influence there. Okay, one of the things we did in that study, and I'll show you we repeated, is we tried to assess the effect of being in an environment. So we asked the twins about their families. We had measures of father's education, mother's education, father's SES. We had a special questionnaire I put together about various kinds of things, physical things in the home. And then we had the family environment scale, which is a report on how you were. None of these things explained any of the variants. None. Now, this kind of data is pretty weak. Recall is not great, et cetera, but something like, what did your father do when you were a kid, and you get a description, is not that bad. So we did make a check on those sort of things. Those things didn't explain anything. David Licken collected EEG data. He had a big lab over in the psychiatry department, and we did the EEGs on the twins. And of course, that data could have thrown doubt on the IQ data. If their brains are dramatically different, why would they have similar IQs? Well, the EEG data was actually, our twins were apart, he had some of his own twins, and it turns out the Germans, Bomben had a big lab, Stassen and Bomben had a big lab in Germany, and they were collecting the same data with the same instruments. So they pooled all the data, and their conclusion was the twins are as identical to each other as the same person is to him or herself. This is a highly reliable kind of measure, works beautifully. No difference between the EEGs in terms of heritability, reared together or reared apart. Stunning data. Well, okay, this is after about 10 years of work, but our sample size is not great, and it was clear to me that if I could continue the study, I could gather a body of data that would allow me to actually test a wide variety of theories and develop some ideas. So we decided to soldier on for as long as we could, and the number of twins got smaller and smaller. It was harder and harder to find twins, but we did it for another 10 years. And we did it also because nobody could accuse us of stopping at that point because we'd confirmed a hypothesis. If we continued to gather data as long as possible, nobody could say, well, you only gathered it until you proved your point. So we got around that issue. Turning to structural theories of intelligence, I'd always disliked the fluid crystallized theory. Disliked it intensely, in fact, from back in 1968 when I wrote my own first paper on intelligence. But by the way, Raymond Cattell was one of my heroes, no question about it. One of the greatest individual difference psychologists that ever lived, no questions. So we included his battery, because if you use his battery to test his theory, nobody can say you were fooling around. We also included the Hawaii battery, which was a special battery put together for a big project in Hawaii, which included the Raven. And I added a bunch of spatial tests because a number of my students were doing spatial research. And we used the Wechsler, and it was administered independently by 2 testers, so nobody could say there's a tester bias. The Raven was given that way too. Well, we completely refuted the Cattell-Horn theory. We refuted Carroll's theory. By the way, Carroll was also a hero of mine. I, in fact, arranged for him to get an honorary degree from the University of Minnesota. So I held him in very high esteem. But when you're doing science, it doesn't matter whether you're friends or not. If the data refutes them, they're refuted. That's the whole point of doing the research. Well, we could modify the best fitting model a little bit, and that led us to what we call a 4-stratum theory. By the way, Arthur Jensen said nobody had ever demonstrated a 4-stratum theory in the domain of intelligence. And it turns out it was because nobody used enough tests. Use a big enough battery, you can get a 4-stratum theory. But if you modify, you've got to replicate, because you can be capitalizing on chance. Well, we replicated multiple times. 2 of our papers, and the group in Edinburgh actually tested the Cattell-Horn Carroll theory, and our model fits the data better repeatedly. And the data is available. Anybody can go and analyze that data set. I've been trying to kill the Cattell-Horn idea of fluid crystallized intelligence for a long time, and the theory just won't die. Our Dutch colleagues have gathered a lot of data together to show that that's just the case. They've also analyzed big data sets regarding the Cattell-Horn Carroll theory, and they've argued GF and G are indistinguishable. The studies that have enough power show this. There is no difference between GF and G. It's G. Frank has made a lot of arguments along these lines. He's right, but he still uses the terminology GF, GC. Is G chimerical? Well, we had a data set to test it, and we've shown repeatedly, notice the second paper, 5 different test batteries. The first one, our data set, and Tim Salthouse has replicated it with the large data sets that he's been using in his studies of aging. There's 1G if you have a good enough cluster of tests, can't be too small, but you got to have at least 6, 7 tests at a minimum. But once you get that number of tests, and they're good tests, it's the same G. We've now analyzed our IQ data within the framework of the model that we propose. And we can show, using identical twins read apart, fraternal twins read apart, the entire data sample, that the heritability of G is about 0.77, which is the number Cyril Burton reported. It's embarrassing. In fact, we've had a number like that for a long time. My students even made a t-shirt that had 0.77 on it. So I could be a target. There's no doubt that it's heritable. The various facets of the model are also largely heritable. We repeated our attempt to see if we could explain the similarity from by environmental measures. The last columns are virtually all zeros, just not the case. Is G real? Gould again. Now, remember, Marv said you should pit theories against each other. Well, Gould is one theory. There's no genetic effect, that all this stuff is wrong, and our theory that maybe Darwin is right. So he argued it's an error of reification. The notion that such a nebulous, socially defined concept as intelligence might be defined as a thing with a locus in the brain and defined by degrees of heritability, and that it might be measured as a single number, thus permitting a unilateral ranking of people according to the amount they possess, is an error of reification. Go to Google and go to Wikipedia and look up reification. I don't want to get into politics, but it's a Marxist, primarily a Marxist term, and it means invalid. And in fact, the Marxists in charge of Russia, when they were in charge, argued that genes were a reification, and they were invalid. And they murdered most of the Mendelian geneticists. Murdered them. And completely wiped out genetics as a scientific discipline in that domain. Of course, IQ is not a thing. It's a construct. We deal with constructs all the time. And whether it's real or not is an empirical question. You bring evidence to bear on the question. And so I tried to do that. I actually reviewed the entire animal literature on the topic. And if G is a socially defined concept, as Gould claims, then why does it appear in a wide range of species and consistently relate positively to brain size and found to be heritable in one species after another? Gould is simply wrong. There's something fundamental going on, and we have a topic here worth studying. Okay, let's turn to personality. I'm going to have to move through, got what? 2 minutes? Okay, well, I'm not going to be able to get to the end. Let me point out that personality is also heritable. We gave the MPQ, which is a wonderful test, to 12 different kinships, 4,300 people, computed the heritabilities, and they're virtually identical to our twins reared apart. And they're virtually identical to twins reared together. Heritable trait. I'm going to skip a couple slides here and point out the MPQ, the MMPI, the CPI, the Big Five, personality measures of other traits, all give the same results. No question about it. Even if you use a projective test, like Jane Levenger's Washington University sentence completion test, you get exactly the same results. In fact, I thought this was going to wash out. I thought Jane Levenger's test was a measure of IQ, or verbal ability. We parcel it out, it's still heritable. It doesn't matter how you measure it, what method you measure it with, you get a heritability. Vocational interests are exactly the same. We gave the Jackson Vocational Interest Inventory because it had been developed like a year before our study started. Unfortunately, it was ipsative, and there's a partially ipsative, there's no problem with that. But our colleagues at Washington, in Western Ontario, unipsitized it and gave it to a large twin sample. So we have heritabilities for the same traits from 2 different studies, and they give virtually identical results. And no common family environmental influence. Identical twins reared together are hardly any more similar than those who are reared apart. Now, it'd be nice to have unrelated individuals reared together, see, as a control. Nobody's ever done it. Big study. We couldn't afford psychological tests for the huge samples we're going to get from the Minnesota Twin Registry. We created our own inventory. We gave it to our twins. We gave it to those twins reared together. We got exactly the same result as when you compare with the Western Ontario people. This is replication with a vengeance. In fact, replication is standard in behavior genetics, virtually. In the domain of attitudes, we've studied religiousness, authoritarianism, and conservatism. They all correlate very highly with each other. And I can give you some data on religiousness. I can give you some data on authoritarianism. And I can show you that they correlate together, and they correlate with the MPQ. The traditionalism scale of the MPQ is a reverse measure of authoritarianism. And it correlates with conservatism, and it correlates about 0.7 with the regular authoritarianism. So these 3 traits correlate all together. You can model that data And the best fitting model to that data is a common underlying causal factor, which I like to call obedience to authority. Again, in deference to Stanley Milgram, who did absolutely classic work on this topic. There's a major trait underlying these three major attitude variables, and it's highly heritable. Very interesting results. And I want to do the last one. I won't be able to get to my theory of drives, but Bill Fox was a colleague in the department, and he studied motor behavior. And so right from the beginning, we said, well, why don't we put a motor skill into the assessment and see if learning is heritable. Here's a picture of my colleague Nancy Siegel on the task. The task is to hold the stylus on the little nickel-shaped thing while it goes around. So, completely novel learning task for almost everybody, okay? When we publish this in Nature, that's why I've got there, but let me just show you. The heritability slowly increases with time over 3 days of practice. And this is because the MZ twins become more similar and the DZ twins become less similar. I think this is an absolutely classic study. I thought learning psychologists would jump all over this and try to repeat it and replicate it. I mean, the trait learning, as measured by this task, is heritable. Never been replicated. It's over 20 years. What in the world is the matter with psychologists? All right, let me summarize. There's now been a massive meta-analysis of the entire literature on twins. 50 years of twin research, published in Nature Genetics, and across all traits, 17,804, the reported heritability is 0.49, which is precisely what we report for most traits in our study. Our data probably is in there, but would be like a minuscule part of the data analysis. So I think the case is closed. In fact, you barely have to measure anything. It's going to, if you measure it reliably, it's going to be heritable. I want to just give some credit here to somebody. I have a theory that partly explains this. It's called experience producing drive theory. And it was created in 1962 by this young comparative psychologist, Keith J. Hayes, who with his wife did an amazingly difficult long-term research project. They raised the chimp in their home as a child. And they got a feeling for what evolution creates when it creates humans and when it creates chimpanzees. And as a result of his work, he came up with this very, very powerful theory. I've used it many times, but I've given full-hour lecture on just this particular theory. But this is a paper well worth reading and is another example of a fabulous piece of work in the scientific literature that's virtually been ignored. I've developed it, and my colleague Sandra Scar has worked on it. So I want to point out there are a couple of people who have tried to apply this to human beings and not succeeded. Let me jump to the end. Here's a photo of Marv Dunnette with his first wife and the Bouchard family on a canoe trip sponsored by the psychology department. And what I want to say here is, Marv, thanks for bringing me aboard. It's been a fantastic voyage. Thank you very much.